Today, we have an unusual program. It is based on photographic documents that have not been shown to the public for many years. And you know, if you show such photos in Russia today, you could easily get charged for denying the decisive role of the Soviet people in the defeat of Nazi Germany. Or something similar to that. And just for showing truthful photos taken by Soviet photographers. But why? The answer is simple. These photos don't fit into the approved concept of the liberation of Berlin. They clearly depict a completely different picture, not bravado or the so-called victory frenzy. In general, everything that propaganda has been filling Russian television with for the past several decades. So watch this episode until the end. And you will see not only many new details about the spring of 1945, but also how those events are directly connected to the war that Russia is currently waging in Ukraine. I'm Semyon and this is Mega Show TV. Let's begin. Berlin, spring of 45, spring 1945. Let me first introduce you to the atmosphere that prevailed in the middle of spring 1945 in the Third Reich, which was already living out its last days. I already made a separate video about the storming of Berlin and the colossal losses suffered by the Red Army. But today I would like to show you more specifically, using rare photographs, the price that was paid for that victory through the example of particular ordinary soldiers. I would like to show you the underside of war. Although any reasonable person already understands that war is horror, war is blood, destruction, crying children, fathers, brothers, and husbands who never returned home. And only in the minds of Russians, thanks to the intense work of the propaganda machine, war has been presented for many years as parades, fireworks, and May as a liberator. But thanks to photographers who, at the time, were not afraid to capture not only the grand ceremonial moments, and also to the people who preserved these photos, we can see what the final stage of World War II actually looked like. By the way, nowadays most of these photos can be found on foreign websites, not on sites with the .ru domain. If you type something like Berlin photo 1945 in Yandex, you'll get a photo of the Reichstag with the red flag, a march of soldiers against the backdrop of destroyed buildings, high-ranking military officers inspecting the skeleton of the fallen giant. Or occasionally you might come across happy, joyful Red Army soldiers or Berliners themselves. It's quite strange. Knowing the real events, you can say that many of these photos are staged. Soviet propaganda turned the very fact of victory into a triumph, but much was left behind the scenes. Today we'll look into the heart of the ruined city and see it through the eyes of those who lived and died among the ruins. This won't be a heroic chronicle. It will be a chronicle of pain on both sides of the barricades. Berlin, the other side of victory. These photographs were hidden and remained unknown for a long time. One of the photographers whose work I will show you today was Valery Fominsky, a surgeon by profession who became a military photographer. He was not just a witness to the events, but was at their epicenter and wrote about them in his notes. My task was simple: to record so that it would not be forgotten, so that people would know what stood behind this victory. He took photographs knowing that these shots were not meant for the general public because they showed the war not from a heroic perspective, but a human one. As has already become known during my recent research, the Red Army suffered losses of more than 1 million during the Berlin offensive operation. We won't talk now about those who finished their journey and remained forever in German soil, but we'll touch on the fate of those who survived but were wounded in those spring days of 1945. In this photo, we see a wounded soldier, the only survivor from the tank crew. And the author himself captioned this photo: "A wound is a wound, but duty is duty." The conclusion is simple: if the wounds aren't serious, they bandaged you up and sent you back into battle. And this isn't Berlin, but East Germany, April 1945. But the caption makes it even clearer how wounded soldiers were treated before the decisive battle of World War II. Those lightly wounded were sent back into the ranks. And in the next group of photographs, we can observe the very process of transporting wounded soldiers to field hospitals. Specifically, in this photograph and the next two, the process is shown as a group. Wounded soldiers after the battle are being brought to a field medical unit on the outskirts of Berlin in April of 45. Without a doubt, I would like to express my immense gratitude to all the medics who carried soldiers off the battlefield, assisted in their transportation, and most importantly, provided such vital help. In difficult conditions, under bombings, in terrifying circumstances of constant shelling, their heroism is no less than that of the soldiers themselves. And now, I present to you rare archival photos directly from the hospitals. How different is this from the typical photos we associate with the year 45? Here we won't see smiles and joy or other attributes of photos from the Russian internet that try to convey the atmosphere of those days. In these shots we see all the pain that war causes. What unknown, indelible wounds, both on the body and in the soul, does it leave for the rest of their lives for those who survived? As Jonathan House wrote in his book The Battle for Berlin about the Soviet soldiers who reached Berlin, they sacrificed their health on the battlefield. According to statistics, only 10 soldiers who went through the battle were deemed fit for service. The rest were left permanently crippled, either physically or morally. And here are a few more truly unique photos from April 1945 from Eastern Germany, specifically from the area of the Silo Heights. Let me remind you that it was from this bridgehead that the Red Army launched a frontal assault on the German capital. And it was there, during the local assaults, that according to various historians' estimates, at least 10,000 soldiers died each day. There's no need to even mention the number of wounded. For example, the photo you're seeing now. Its title is brief, A Farewell to the Fallen Tank Crewmen. The next photo shows a unique moment. A wounded soldier is being transported to the regimental medical station on a self-propelled gun right after the Silo slaughter. And the last photo from the same period. Here we can see a farewell salute in memory of the fallen tankers. And their number also reached into the hundreds in just a few days at the start of the Berlin offensive operation. The next group of photos that I managed to find is dedicated to the relationship between the liberating soldiers and the local residents. Here, as they say, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, the Soviet troops really did liberate the Germans from the fascist plague. On the other hand, they deprived about 3 million residents of the city of the most important thing, their homes, the buildings where more than one generation of Berliners had grown up. Photographer and artist Yevgeny Lvov gave this work a very fitting title. In Berlin, matches are not needed. Indeed, by the end of 1945, the former beautiful medieval city looked more like a wasteland. And these are shots dated May 8, which show a Red Army officer announcing to the local residents that the bloodiest war in human history has come to an end, the aforementioned Valery Fomin. Belinsky, the author of this shot, captioned it like this. May 8th, attention. We are broadcasting the text of the surrender of the German fascist army. In this photo, you can see Berliners clearing the streets of their hometown near the Reichstag. I would like to show you in the next segment what the city looked like after days of shelling and street fighting. A ghost city. Berlin, May 1945 is essentially a ghost city, a graveyard city. According to BBC data, 95 buildings in the city were completely destroyed. This is how the German doctor Heinrich Feldmann described those days. We walked through the city. The silence was absolute. Only the smell of death reminded us that people had been here. Empty streets, ruins where bodies still lay. The surviving Berliners, mostly women, were suffering from hunger. I have already talked in detail in one of the previous episodes about how many Berlin women became victims of violence at the hands of the Liberators. Now I would like to focus on the humanitarian catastrophe. There is simply no other way to describe what happened in May and June of that year. In fact, food became a currency for which people gave away their last valuables. Here is a quote from the memoirs of a Berlin resident, Martha Richter. We traded my grandmother's ring for 2 pieces of bread. That was our only chance to survive. And this is an excerpt from a 1972 interview with a witness of those events, the Berlin resident Anna Hausmann. In the first month after the battle, each of us lost someone. We buried the dead in our own yards. The civilian population of Berlin paid a terrible price for defeat. Children died of hunger, women hid from violence. There is evidence from the other side as well that the mood in the city was, to put it mildly, grim. Here is an excerpt from a letter kept in the State Military Archive. We have won here, but at what cost? At every step there are corpses. Behind every house there is death. That's what one of the Soviet soldiers wrote in a letter home. And to conclude this segment, I would like to show you some exclusive photographs. These are panoramic photos of the city. What it was really like in those days. Thanks to the combination of several shots, we can see the true picture of what was happening. The former heart of the Reich's capital and the embankment of the Spree River, looking as if it's right after an apocalypse. Why have the photographs and other archival materials that I showed you today not been published for so long and even now are so hard to find? The answer is simple. They didn't fit the heroic narrative. Soviet propaganda wanted the war to look like a triumph. But behind this triumph were millions of deaths, broken destinies, and ruined lives. And these photos and eyewitness accounts remind us that war is not about victories and parades, but about suffering, pain, and fear. And I think it's very important to remember both sides of that story so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. A link between eras. Have you ever wondered why Russians now go to war so easily? Why do millions, knowing that death awaits them, still march into the meat grinder without even asking questions? I thought about it and realized that's how they were taught. For decades they were convinced that war is about heroism, about victory, about glory. But no one talked about blood, suffering, or broken lives. No one ever told them how to go on living, if you even survive at all. All this truth was hidden behind beautiful slogans, as if it never existed. And now this silence has become a part of Russia itself. That's why so many people today are making the same mistake, not realizing how it all ends. You see, for many years, for entire decades, ideas were instilled into the masses. Everything for victory. The end justifies the means. Women will just have more children. These slogans became the symbol of an entire era. An era that shaped generations accustomed to sacrificing themselves without question. No one on television ever said what would happen after the war. No one in the news broadcasts reported how those who survived should live. On the contrary, a soldier was just a means to achieve goals. And his life, his mind, his future, Putin doesn't care about any of that. For almost 3 years now, Russians have been going to their deaths without protest, without asking questions. After all, in their minds, there's a clear and simple belief. Dying for the motherland is a heroic deed. For some reason, it never occurs to anyone that living for the motherland and not invading someone else's land is a heroic deed, or rather, that's just normal life. I wouldn't want to justify the occupying Russian army, but one of the factors that has influenced and continues to influence the attitude of ordinary Russians toward the current war is the glorification of that so-called Great War over all these years. This is not a coincidence at all. This is a deliberate influence of propaganda, especially after Putin came to power. Conclusions. The Soviet system already glorified the war, hid its dark side, turned a blind eye to the millions who died, were maimed, and psychologically destroyed, leaving only a pretty picture for the authorities. And to that was added the maniacal desire of one Kremlin dictator to repeat it. And all of this with the support of his electorate, from Moscow to the farthest reaches. And, unfortunately, as long as Russians see only glory in war, as long as they remain silent about the fact that war destroys not only bodies but also souls, the people of the vast land will go to slaughter like faceless pawns in someone else's games. But it's important to understand and remember, true victory is not the destruction of the enemy, but the preservation of life. Not parades, but a future where no one will want war to happen again, knowing what it brings. That's all I have. Goodbye, everyone.